In the heart of London, where centuries of tradition meet modern security protocols, a single moment of miscommunication would trigger a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of royal protection. What started as a routine security check at Buckingham Palace would escalate into an international incident, forcing the most secure compound in Britain into complete lockdown. The sound of a taser crackling through the crisp morning air would be heard around the world. But the real story lies in what happened next, when protocol met panic, when duty collided with desperation, and when the gates of the palace sealed shut, trapping secrets that would change everything. This is not just a story about security gone wrong. This is about the human cost of split-second decisions, the weight of protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and the moment when the most guarded place on earth became a fortress under siege from within. Detective Inspector Marcus Wellington adjusted his radio one final time as he stepped through the staff entrance of Buckingham Palace. The morning mist still clung to the Victoria Memorial, and the early tourists were just beginning to gather behind the ornate black railings. For Marcus, this was supposed to be a routine assignment, 3 months of palace security detail while recovering from a shoulder injury sustained during a high-speed pursuit in South London. The Metropolitan Police had assigned him to the palace security team as a temporary measure, giving him time to heal while keeping his skills sharp. At 42, Marcus had seen enough action on the streets of London to appreciate what he thought would be the relative calm of royal protection duty. He had been wrong about the calm part, but he wouldn't realize that until it was far too late. Palace Guard Lieutenant James Morrison had been stationed at Buckingham Palace for 8 years. Unlike Marcus, who was still learning the intricate web of protocols that governed palace security, James knew every corner, every routine, and every face that belonged within these walls. His military precision and unwavering attention to detail had earned him the respect of both his superiors and the royal family themselves. The morning briefing had been standard. The Duke and Duchess would be departing at 11:30 for a charity event in Westminster. The Queen had no public engagements but would be receiving the ambassador of Sweden in the blue drawing room at 2 o'clock. Security protocols were tight, but routine, the kind of day that should have passed without incident. Marcus had been assigned to the East Wing checkpoint, monitoring the flow of staff and authorized personnel through the service corridors. The East Wing housed several important offices and provided access to the private quarters where family members stayed during their visits to London. It was considered one of the more sensitive areas, requiring constant vigilance and strict adherence to clearance protocols. The first sign of trouble came at 9:45 when Marcus noticed James Morrison approaching his checkpoint without his standard identification badge visible. James was carrying a sealed envelope marked with the royal cipher and appeared to be in a hurry. Under normal circumstances, this wouldn't have raised any alarms. James was well known throughout the palace, and his face was as familiar as the portraits hanging on the walls. But Marcus was new, and he had been specifically instructed during his orientation to follow all protocols without exception, regardless of how well he might recognize someone. The training officer had been particularly emphatic about this point, sharing stories of security breaches that had occurred when guards made assumptions based on familiarity rather than proper procedure. As James approached the checkpoint, Marcus stepped forward with his hand raised in the universal gesture for stop. The protocol was simple. Everyone needed to present proper identification and submit to a basic security scan, no exceptions. James, however, was focused on the urgent message he was carrying and barely registered Marcus's gesture. The envelope in James's hand contained sensitive intelligence about a potential security threat that had been identified during the early morning briefing with MI5. While not an immediate danger, it required the attention of the senior security coordinator, and James had been tasked with delivering it without delay. His mind was occupied with the contents of the message and the need to reach his destination quickly. Marcus called out, asking James to stop and present his credentials. The acoustics in the corridor were poor, and James didn't hear the request clearly. He continued walking toward the checkpoint, assuming that Marcus had simply nodded him through as guards typically did when they recognized each other. The miscommunication escalated when Marcus, following his training to the letter, stepped directly into James's path and demanded to see identification. James, surprised by the confrontation and still focused on his mission, tried to explain about the urgent message while reaching into his jacket pocket for his credentials. From Marcus's perspective, James's sudden movement toward his jacket could have been reaching for a weapon. The training that had been drilled into every police officer kicked in automatically. In high-security environments, Any unexpected movement by an unidentified person was treated as a potential threat until proven otherwise. The palace corridors, with their thick walls and heavy carpeting, seemed to muffle sound while amplifying tension. Marcus's hand moved instinctively to his taser, a piece of equipment he had hoped never to use during his palace assignment. His training with the Metropolitan Police had taught him that in confined spaces, a taser was often the safest option for subduing a potential threat without risking collateral damage. James, realizing that the situation was escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding, tried to slow his movements and explain his identity. But the damage was already done. Marcus, operating on adrenaline and training, interpreted James's continued approach as aggressive behavior from an unidentified individual in a secure area. The moment that would change everything happened in less than 3 seconds. Marcus drew his taser and shouted a final warning. James, hearing the command clearly for the first time, stopped abruptly and raised his hands to show he wasn't a threat. But Marcus, already committed to the action by his training and the split-second decision-making that police work demands, activated the taser. The electrical charge struck James in the chest, sending 50,000 volts through his body and dropping him instantly to the marble floor of the corridor. The envelope he had been carrying scattered its contents across the pristine black and white tiles, classified documents mixing with the echo of James's surprised cry. The sound of the taser discharge was distinctive and unmistakable. In the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace, where the most violent sound was usually the chiming of antique clocks, the electric crackle was as shocking as a gunshot. Within seconds, the incident had triggered a cascade of emergency protocols that would transform a simple misunderstanding into a full-scale security crisis. Palace security operates on the principle that any use of force, regardless of the circumstances, represents a potential breach that must be contained immediately. The moment Marcus's taser fired, automatic alarms began sounding throughout the security command center. Emergency lights started flashing in restricted areas, and every guard in the building received an immediate alert on their communication devices. James Morrison lay on the floor, conscious but temporarily incapacitated by the electrical shock. The classified documents from the envelope were spread around him like pieces of a puzzle that no one had time to solve. Marcus stood over him, taser still in hand, beginning to realize that he had just tasered a fellow security officer in one of the most protected buildings in the world. The first responders arrived within 90 seconds, their boots echoing through the corridors as they rushed to assess the situation. Senior Security Coordinator Elizabeth Hayes arrived to find a scene that defied easy explanation. A Metropolitan Police detective standing over a palace guard who was slowly recovering from being tasered, while classified documents lay scattered across the floor. Elizabeth had spent 15 years in royal protection, working her way up from a junior officer to one of the most trusted security professionals in the palace. She had managed everything from bomb threats to domestic disputes among staff members, but she had never encountered a situation where the security apparatus had effectively turned on itself. The immediate priority was medical attention for James, who was beginning to regain full control of his muscles, but remained shaken by the experience. Palace medical staff arrived quickly, conducting a thorough assessment to ensure that no lasting damage had been done. The taser had functioned exactly as designed, incapacitating without causing permanent harm, but the psychological impact of the incident was already beginning to ripple outward. As Elizabeth began interviewing both Marcus and James to understand what had happened, the larger implications of the incident were becoming clear. A security breach had occurred, but it wasn't a breach by an external threat. Instead, the security system had malfunctioned from within, raising questions about protocols, training, and the integration of temporary personnel into the palace security structure. The classified documents were quickly secured and their contents verified, but their temporary exposure added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. While no sensitive information had been compromised, the fact that classified materials had been scattered in an unsecured area during a security incident required additional investigation and reporting. Word of the incident began spreading through the palace's internal communication networks. Staff members who had heard the commotion started asking questions, and the usually seamless operation of the palace began showing signs of strain. The incident had occurred in a corridor that connected several important administrative offices, and the temporary shutdown of the area was affecting normal operations. Marcus found himself at the center of a storm he had never intended to create. His actions had been technically correct according to his police training, but the context of the palace environment had transformed proper procedure into a diplomatic nightmare. He began to understand that palace security operated under different rules, where relationships and recognition played a larger role than the rigid protocols he was accustomed to following. James, as he recovered from the shock, found himself grappling with the realization that his familiarity with palace security had made him complacent. He had grown accustomed to moving through the building without the constant awareness of protocols that governed interactions between security personnel. The incident had reminded him, in the most dramatic way possible, that even within the palace walls, security remained a deadly serious business. The ripple effects of those 3 seconds were only beginning. As Elizabeth Hayes prepared her initial report on the incident, she knew that the reverberations would reach far beyond the corridor where it had occurred. Palace security was built on trust, precision, and the seamless coordination of multiple agencies and personnel. That foundation had been shaken, and the tremors were about to spread throughout the entire complex. The morning that had started as routine was rapidly becoming anything but ordinary. And, as the clock in the corridor chimed 10 o'clock, everyone involved began to realize that the real crisis was just beginning. The emergency protocols at Buckingham Palace had been refined over decades of experience, designed to respond to threats ranging from terrorist attacks to natural disasters. But they had never been tested against a scenario where the threat came from within the security apparatus itself. As Elizabeth Hayes coordinated the immediate response to the tossing incident, she realized that the standard playbook didn't have a chapter for this particular crisis. Within 5 minutes of the taser discharge, the Palace Security Command Center had transformed into a hub of controlled chaos. Banks of monitors displayed feeds from hundreds of security cameras throughout the complex, while communication officers coordinated with multiple agencies to assess the scope and nature of the incident. The initial assumption was that a security breach had occurred, possibly involving an imposter who had somehow gained access to restricted areas. Chief Security Officer David Richardson had been in his office reviewing the day's schedule when the alert came through his secure communication system. A 27-year veteran of royal protection who had served 3 monarchs, David had seen his share of security incidents. But the initial report from the East Wing checkpoint was unlike anything in his experience. A Metropolitan Police officer had tasered a palace guard during what appeared to be a routine security check. David's first instinct was to assume there had been some mistake in the reporting. Palace guards and Metropolitan Police officers assigned to royal protection worked closely together, and conflicts between them were virtually unheard of. The idea that one would use force against the other seemed so improbable that he initially wondered if the report had confused an exercise or training scenario with a real incident. But, as more details filtered in through the communication network, the reality of the situation became undeniable. Detective Inspector Marcus Wellington, assigned to the Palace security team just 3 weeks earlier, had used his taser against Lieutenant James Morrison, an 8-year veteran of the Queen's Guard with an impeccable service record. The incident had occurred during what should have been a routine checkpoint interaction. The immediate medical response was led by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the palace physician who maintained a small but well-equipped medical facility within the complex. Dr. Mitchell had experience treating everything from minor injuries sustained during ceremonial duties to more serious medical emergencies involving staff and visitors. However, she had never treated a taser injury within the palace walls. James Morrison was transported to the medical facility on a stretcher, though he was conscious and able to speak. The effects of the electrical shock were wearing off, but palace protocol required a thorough medical evaluation following any use of force incident. Dr. Mitchell conducted a comprehensive examination, checking for signs of cardiac irregularities, burns at the contact points, and any other complications that might arise from the electrical discharge. While the medical team attended to James, the security investigation was already in full swing. Detective Chief Inspector Patricia Collins from the Metropolitan Police's Royalty and Specialist Protection Unit arrived at the palace within 15 minutes of receiving notification of the incident. DCI Collins was responsible for overseeing all Metropolitan Police personnel assigned to royal protection duties, and an incident involving one of her officers using force against palace personnel was precisely the kind of crisis she had hoped never to face. The interview with Marcus Wellington was conducted in a secure conference room in the Security Administrative Wing. Marcus sat across from DCI Collins and Chief Security Officer Richardson, still wearing his police-issued tactical vest and with his taser secured in its holster. The weight of what had happened was evident in his expression, though he maintained the professional demeanor that had carried him through 15 years of police work. Marcus's account of the incident was precise and methodical. He described his assignment to the East Wing checkpoint, the approach of an unidentified individual who failed to respond to his initial requests for identification, and his decision to use the taser when the individual made what appeared to be an aggressive movement toward a concealed object. From Marcus's perspective, he had followed his training exactly as prescribed and had responded appropriately to a potential threat in a high-security environment. DCI Collins listened carefully, taking detailed notes while recognizing that Marcus's actions, while potentially problematic in the palace context, were consistent with standard Metropolitan Police procedures for dealing with uncooperative individuals in secure areas. The challenge was that palace security operated under different protocols, where recognition and relationship often superseded strict adherence to identification procedures. The interview with James Morrison took place in the medical facility, where Dr. Mitchell had cleared him for limited duty following her examination. James's account of the incident revealed the other side of the miscommunication. He described his urgent mission to deliver classified intelligence, his familiarity with the security personnel and procedures, and his confusion when confronted by an officer he didn't recognize who seemed unusually aggressive about checking his credentials. From James's perspective, the incident represented a failure of the informal systems that allowed palace security to function efficiently. The integration of new personnel, particularly temporary assignments from outside agencies, had created gaps in the relationship-based security network that the palace relied upon. His assumption that he would be recognized and waved through had proven dangerously incorrect. As the interviews proceeded, Elizabeth Hayes was coordinating the broader security response to the incident. The palace operated under the assumption that any security incident could be part of a larger, coordinated attack, and protocols required a comprehensive assessment of all palace operations until the nature and scope of the threat could be determined. The most immediate concern was the upcoming departure of the Duke and Duchess for their Westminster charity event. The royal convoy was scheduled to depart in less than 2 hours, and the security incident in the East Wing had the potential to compromise the carefully coordinated protection arrangements for the royal movement. Elizabeth faced the difficult decision of whether to recommend delaying the departure until the security situation could be fully resolved. Palace Communications Director Helen Walsh was dealing with the external implications of the incident. While no public announcement had been made, the emergency response had been visible to palace staff and some visitors, and rumors were already beginning to circulate. The challenge was maintaining public confidence in palace security while conducting a thorough investigation into what had clearly been a significant breakdown in procedures. The classified documents that had been scattered during the incident added another layer of complexity to the crisis. The intelligence report that James had been carrying contained information about a potential security threat that, while not immediately urgent, required attention from senior security personnel. The irony that the incident had delayed the delivery of security intelligence was not lost on anyone involved in the investigation. Security camera footage from the East Wing corridor provided an objective record of the incident, though it raised as many questions as it answered. The video clearly showed the approach of James Morrison, Marcus Wellington's attempts to stop him, and the eventual use of the taser. What the cameras couldn't capture was the audio communication between the two men or the thought processes that led to the escalation. Analysis of the footage revealed several factors that had contributed to the incident. The corridor lighting, while adequate for normal operations, created shadows that made it difficult to see identification badges or other security credentials from a distance. The acoustics of the space, with its high ceilings and hard surfaces, had likely interfered with clear communication between the two officers. The incident was also highlighting broader issues with the integration of temporary personnel into palace security operations. Marcus Wellington was one of several Metropolitan Police officers who had been assigned to palace duty on temporary basis, and the training they received, while comprehensive, was necessarily abbreviated compared to the extensive preparation that permanent palace security personnel underwent. As the investigation continued, the ripple effects of the incident began spreading throughout the palace. Staff members who had heard about the incident were asking questions about security procedures and expressing concerns about their own safety. The incident had shaken the sense of security and order that was fundamental to the palace's function as both a working royal residence and a symbol of stability. The Queen's private secretary, Sir Anthony Davies, was briefed on the situation and faced the delicate task of determining whether to inform Her Majesty immediately or wait until more information was available. Palace protocol generally shielded the royal family from operational security matters unless they posed a direct threat, but an incident involving the use of force within the palace walls was unprecedented in recent history. Meanwhile, the Metropolitan Police Command structure was grappling with the implications of one of their officers being involved in such a high-profile incident. The use of force by police officers was always subject to scrutiny, but when it occurred within the confines of Buckingham Palace against a member of the Royal Guard, the stakes were exponentially higher. As the clock approached 11 o'clock, the decision about the royal convoy became increasingly urgent. The Duke and Duchess were expecting to depart on schedule, and the charity event in Westminster had been planned for months. Canceling or delaying the engagement would require explanations that could potentially compromise the ongoing security investigation. Chief Security Officer Richardson found himself at the center of multiple competing priorities. The investigation into the tossing incident required thorough attention, but the ongoing security operations of the palace couldn't be suspended indefinitely. The challenge was maintaining the appearance of normal operations while dealing with what was clearly an abnormal situation. The incident had also triggered automatic notifications to several external agencies, including MI5 and the Cabinet Office. These organizations had their own interests in understanding what had happened and ensuring that it didn't represent a broader security vulnerability. The palace was no longer dealing with an isolated incident, but with a multi-agency investigation that could have far-reaching implications. As Elizabeth Hayes prepared to brief the senior leadership team, she knew that the next few hours would be critical in determining whether the incident remained a contained security matter or escalated into something much larger. The decision about the royal convoy would be the first major test of how the palace would balance security concerns with operational continuity in the aftermath of the crisis. The morning that had begun with routine security briefings had become a complex emergency response operation involving multiple agencies, competing priorities, and unprecedented circumstances. And, as the investigation deepened, it was becoming clear that the incident was raising questions about fundamental aspects of palace security that would require careful examination and possibly significant changes to long-established procedures. At 11:15, as the Duke and Duchess prepared for their scheduled departure, Chief Security Officer David Richardson made the decision that would transform a security incident into a full-scale crisis. Based on the ongoing investigation and concerns about potential security vulnerabilities revealed by the tossing incident, he ordered a complete lockdown of Buckingham Palace grounds. The lockdown protocol was the most severe security measure available to palace authorities, reserved for situations involving imminent threats to royal safety or national security. It had been used only 3 times in the previous 30 years, once during the 1991 Gulf War threat assessment, once following the September 11th attacks, and once during a 2017 terrorist threat that later proved to be unfounded. Each previous activation had been in response to external threats. This was the first time the protocol had been triggered by an internal security incident. The immediate effect of the lockdown was the complete sealing of all palace entrances and exits. The ornate Victoria Gates, through which thousands of tourists passed daily to observe the changing of the guard, were closed and secured. Staff entrances around the perimeter were sealed, and all access to the palace grounds was suspended indefinitely. The Queen Victoria Memorial, surrounded by its usual crowd of tourists and street performers, suddenly found itself at the center of an exclusion zone. Inside the palace, the lockdown meant that no one could enter or leave without explicit authorization from the Security Command Center. The Duke and Duchess, who had been making final preparations for their charity event departure, found themselves confined to the palace indefinitely. The carefully planned convoy that was to have transported them to Westminster was ordered to stand down, with armed escort vehicles returning to their staging areas. The decision to implement the lockdown had been influenced by several factors beyond the immediate tossing incident. The scattered classified documents had contained intelligence about a broader security assessment that raised questions about potential vulnerabilities in palace operations. While the intelligence didn't suggest an imminent threat, the timing of the security breach in the East Wing had created concerns about whether the incidents were connected. Elizabeth Hayes coordinated the lockdown implementation from the Security Command Center, managing communication with over 200 staff members who were now effectively trapped within the palace complex. The command center's banks of monitors displayed feeds from security cameras throughout the grounds, showing the gradual realization among tourists and onlookers that something significant was happening. The public relations challenge was immediate and severe. The closure of the palace gates during normal operating hours, without any prior announcement or explanation, sparked speculation among the gathered tourists and quickly attracted attention from news media. Palace Communications Director Helen Walsh found herself managing inquiries from journalists who had noticed the unusual security activity and were demanding explanations. The initial public statement was carefully crafted to provide minimal information while avoiding panic. The palace announced that normal operations had been temporarily suspended due to a security review, and that further information would be provided when available. The statement deliberately avoided any reference to the tossing incident or the specific nature of the security concerns. Detective Chief Inspector Patricia Collins was coordinating with the Metropolitan Police Command structure to manage their response to the lockdown. The presence of Metropolitan Police officers within the lockdown palace created jurisdictional complexities, as the officers were effectively cut off from their normal chain of command and communication networks. The incident involving Marcus Wellington had raised questions about the integration of external security personnel that couldn't be fully addressed while the lockdown was in effect. Dr. Sarah Mitchell found her medical facility becoming a central hub for managing the stress and anxiety that the lockdown was creating among palace staff. While James Morrison had been cleared for limited duty following his taser injury, the broader psychological impact of the incident was affecting people throughout the palace. Staff members who had no direct connection to the security breach were experiencing anxiety about their safety and confusion about what was happening. The royal family's response to the lockdown revealed the careful balance between security requirements and royal duties. Her Majesty the Queen, who had been scheduled to receive the Swedish ambassador at 2 o'clock, was briefed on the situation by Sir Anthony Davies and made the decision to proceed with the meeting despite the security concerns. The ambassador, who had arrived at the palace just before the lockdown was implemented, found himself unexpectedly confined to the diplomatic waiting area. The Duke and Duchess faced a more complicated situation. Their charity event in Westminster was a significant engagement that had been planned for months and involved several high-profile supporters and media coverage. The cancellation of their appearance would require explanations that could potentially compromise the security investigation. Palace officials were working frantically to develop alternatives that might allow the engagement to proceed despite the lockdown. As the lockdown entered its second hour, the ripple effects were spreading beyond the palace walls. The charity event organizers were dealing with hundreds of guests who were expecting to meet the Duke and Duchess, while Metropolitan Police commanders were explaining to their superiors why one of their officers was involved in a security incident that had resulted in the most secure building in Britain being sealed shut. The investigation into the original tossing incident continued despite the broader security concerns. Marcus Wellington remained in the secure conference room, where his interview with senior officials had expanded to include representatives from MI5 who were interested in understanding how the incident related to the broader security intelligence that James Morrison had been carrying. Marcus found himself at the center of a crisis that far exceeded anything in his police experience. His split-second decision to use the taser had been tactically sound according to his training, but the context had transformed a routine security procedure into a diplomatic and operational nightmare. The weight of responsibility was becoming increasingly apparent as he learned about the lockdown and its implications. James Morrison, despite being cleared for duty by Dr. Mitchell, was struggling with his own sense of responsibility for the crisis. His familiarity with palace procedures had led him to bypass normal protocol, and his assumption that he would be recognized had contributed to the misunderstanding. The incident had revealed gaps in the palace security system that he felt responsible for exposing. The classified intelligence that had started the chain of events was finally reaching its intended recipients, though several hours later than originally planned. The security assessment it contained identified potential vulnerabilities in palace operations, particularly regarding the integration of temporary personnel from external agencies. The irony that the incident had demonstrated exactly the type of vulnerability described in the intelligence was not lost on the security officials reviewing the document. External pressure was mounting as the lockdown continued. Government ministers were receiving briefings about the situation, and the Cabinet Office was coordinating with Downing Street to ensure that the Prime Minister was kept informed of developments. The palace was a symbol of national stability, and any disruption to its normal operations carried implications far beyond the immediate security concerns. Media attention was intensifying despite the palace's attempts to control information flow. Television news crews were gathering outside the gates, and social media was filling with speculation about what was happening inside the palace. The longer the lockdown continued without explanation, the more dramatic the speculation became. The tourist industry was also feeling immediate effects. Tour guides who regularly brought groups to observe the changing of the guard found themselves having to explain to disappointed visitors why the palace was suddenly inaccessible. Hotels and restaurants in the area that depended on palace tourism were beginning to lose business as word spread about the security situation. Inside the palace, the afternoon schedule was being completely reorganized to accommodate the lockdown. Meetings were canceled, appointments were postponed, and staff members who lived outside the palace were making arrangements to remain overnight if necessary. The palace, designed to be a working royal residence, was becoming a temporary prison for everyone inside. The Security Command Center had become the nerve center for managing not just the investigation, but the broader crisis management operation. Elizabeth Hayes found herself coordinating between multiple agencies, managing staff concerns, dealing with royal family requirements, and maintaining operational security while under intense scrutiny from government officials and media attention. As the afternoon progressed, it became clear that the lockdown had moved far beyond its original purpose. What had begun as a precautionary measure following a security incident had become a major operational crisis that was affecting not just the palace, but the broader functioning of royal duties, government relations, and public confidence in palace security. The decision about when and how to end the lockdown was becoming increasingly complex. Simply reopening the gates would require explanations about why they had been closed, but maintaining the lockdown indefinitely was not sustainable given the operational and public relations costs. The palace found itself trapped between security requirements and the practical necessities of functioning as a working royal residence. Chief Security Officer Richardson faced the most difficult decision of his career. The investigation into the tossing incident was ongoing. The broader security assessment raised legitimate concerns about palace vulnerabilities, and the external pressure for explanations was mounting by the hour. The lockdown that had been implemented as a prudent security measure was becoming a crisis in its own right. As the clock approached 3 o'clock, with the lockdown now in its fourth hour, the palace was no longer dealing with a security incident, but with a full-scale operational emergency that was testing every aspect of its crisis management capabilities. The gates that had been sealed to protect against potential threats were now keeping everyone trapped inside a growing crisis, with no clear resolution in sight. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Buckingham Palace had been under lockdown for nearly 5 hours, and the carefully maintained facade of royal calm was beginning to show cracks. The palace, designed to project stability and tradition, had become a pressure cooker where mounting tensions, conflicting jurisdictions, and unprecedented circumstances were creating a crisis unlike anything in modern royal history. The royal family themselves were experiencing the lockdown differently based on their individual circumstances and responsibilities. Her Majesty the Queen, with her decades of experience managing crises both personal and public, had maintained her scheduled activities as much as possible. The meeting with the Swedish ambassador had proceeded in the blue drawing room, though the ambassador's questions about the unusual security measures had required delicate diplomatic responses from Sir Anthony Davies. The Queen's approach to the crisis reflected her fundamental understanding of royal duty, that the monarchy's strength came from continuity and calm in the face of disruption. However, even her considerable experience couldn't fully prepare her for a situation where the palace's own security apparatus had effectively imprisoned the royal household. The lockdown challenged the basic assumption that the palace was a place of safety and sanctuary. The Duke and Duchess were dealing with more immediate frustrations. Their cancelled charity engagement in Westminster represented not just a personal disappointment, but a potential diplomatic incident with the various organizations and dignitaries who had arranged their schedules around the royal visit. The Duchess, in particular, was concerned about the message that the sudden cancellation would send to the mental health charity that was the focus of the event. Palace staff were experiencing varying levels of stress and confusion as the lockdown stretched into the late afternoon. Kitchen staff found themselves preparing meals for a much larger number of people than usual, as employees who normally would have gone home were now confined to the palace indefinitely. The housekeeping staff faced the unusual challenge of preparing overnight accommodations for dozens of people who hadn't expected to remain in the palace past their normal working hours. Elizabeth Hayes had established a crisis management team in the Security Command Center that included representatives from multiple agencies and departments. The team was dealing with cascading challenges that seemed to multiply by the hour. Each decision created new complications, and each attempt to resolve one aspect of the crisis seemed to reveal new problems that required immediate attention. The investigation into the original tossing incident had evolved into a comprehensive review of palace security procedures, particularly regarding the integration of temporary personnel from external agencies. Detective Chief Inspector Patricia Collins was working with palace security officials to understand how Marcus Wellington's police training had conflicted with palace protocol, and whether similar conflicts might exist with other temporary assignments. Marcus Wellington remained in the secure conference room, where his status had shifted from interview subject to reluctant expert consultant. His police experience was being drawn upon to help understand how other law enforcement personnel might react in similar situations, and whether the incident represented an isolated miscommunication or a systemic problem with security integration. The psychological impact of the lockdown was becoming increasingly evident throughout the palace. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was treating staff members for anxiety and stress-related symptoms, while also monitoring James Morrison for any delayed effects from the taser incident. The medical facility, normally quiet except for routine treatments, had become a counseling center for people struggling with the unprecedented situation. James Morrison had requested to return to active duty, but his request was being complicated by both medical protocols and the ongoing investigation. His intimate knowledge of palace security procedures made him valuable for understanding what had gone wrong, but his status as both victim and potential contributing factor in the incident created conflicts of interest that were difficult to resolve. The communications challenge was intensifying as media attention grew throughout the afternoon. Helen Walsh was fielding inquiries not just from British media, but from international news organizations who were beginning to report on the unusual security activity at Buckingham Palace. The lack of detailed information from official sources was creating a vacuum that was being filled with increasingly dramatic speculation. Social media had become a particular challenge, with tourists who had been outside the palace when the lockdown began posting photos and videos that showed armed police, sealed gates, and emergency vehicles. While none of the social media content revealed actual security details, the images were creating an impression of a major crisis that was difficult to counter without providing more information than the palace was prepared to release. Government coordination was becoming increasingly complex as the lockdown continued. The Cabinet Office was receiving hourly briefings on the situation, while Downing Street was preparing contingency plans in case the crisis escalated further. The Foreign Office was dealing with diplomatic inquiries from other countries whose citizens were affected by the lockdown, including several diplomats who had been trapped inside the palace. The economic impact was spreading beyond the immediate area around the palace. London's tourism industry was beginning to feel effects as tour operators canceled bookings, and hotels received cancellations from visitors who had planned to visit the palace. The uncertainty about when normal operations would resume was preventing businesses from making alternative arrangements. Inside the palace, the afternoon had brought an unexpected sense of community among staff members who found themselves sharing an extraordinary experience. The rigid hierarchies that normally governed palace operations were being temporarily relaxed as everyone faced the same uncertainty about when they would be able to leave. Kitchen staff were sharing meals with administrative personnel, while security officers found themselves explaining procedures to curious diplomats. The Swedish ambassador, Count Erik Lindberg, had found his routine diplomatic visit transformed into an impromptu extended stay. His embassy was coordinating with the Foreign Office to manage his unexpected absence from other scheduled appointments, while he himself was gaining a unique insight into palace crisis management that few diplomats ever experienced. The technical challenges of maintaining the lockdown were becoming increasingly apparent as the afternoon progressed. The palace's communication systems, designed for normal operations, were being stretched by the need to coordinate with multiple external agencies while maintaining security. The command center's equipment was operating at capacity, and backup systems were being prepared in case of technical failures. Chief Security Officer David Richardson was facing pressure from multiple directions. Government officials wanted regular updates on the situation, royal family members needed reassurance about their safety and schedules, and his own security team was dealing with fatigue and stress from managing the unprecedented operation. The decision about when to end the lockdown was becoming more complicated with each passing hour. The intelligence assessment that had started the day's events was being thoroughly reviewed by MI5 officials who were now physically present in the palace. The original security concerns that had prompted James Morrison's urgent message seemed almost minor compared to the vulnerabilities that the day's events had revealed about palace security procedures and crisis management capabilities. External agencies were beginning to question whether the palace's response had been proportionate to the actual security threat. While the tossing incident was serious, some officials were suggesting that the lockdown represented an overreaction that was creating more problems than it was solving. The debate about proportional response was complicated by the unique nature of royal security, where the consequences of underreacting to a threat were considered far more serious than the costs of overreaction. The palace's legal department was becoming increasingly involved as the lockdown continued. Questions about the authority to detain diplomats, staff members, and visitors indefinitely were raising complex legal issues that had never been fully tested. The palace operated under special legal provisions regarding security, but the extent of those powers in the current situation was unclear. As evening approached, the palace was dealing with practical challenges that had never been anticipated in security planning. The kitchen staff was preparing dinner for nearly 4 times the usual number of people, while housekeeping was arranging sleeping accommodations in offices and conference rooms for staff members who lived outside London. The palace, designed as a working royal residence, was being transformed into a temporary refugee center for its own employees. The psychological toll of the lockdown was becoming more evident as the initial adrenaline of the crisis wore off and was replaced by fatigue and frustration. Staff members were beginning to worry about family members who expected them home, while those with medical conditions were concerned about missing medications or treatments that were outside the palace. Elizabeth Hayes realized that the lockdown had reached a point where it was causing more problems than it was solving. The investigation into the original incident was largely complete, the security assessment had been thoroughly reviewed, and the continued confinement of everyone in the palace was creating new risks to both physical and mental health. The challenge was finding a way to end the lockdown that would maintain security while addressing the complex web of problems that the crisis had created. As the palace prepared for what might be an overnight lockdown, everyone involved began to understand that they were experiencing a historic moment that would reshape how royal security operated. The incident had revealed fundamental flaws in systems that had been considered reliable, and the response had created new challenges that would require careful analysis and significant changes to prevent similar crises in the future. The fortress that was supposed to protect the royal family had become a prison for everyone inside, and the question was no longer just about security, but about how to escape the consequences of their own protective measures. As darkness fell over London, Buckingham Palace remained sealed for the 7th consecutive hour, and the crisis that had begun with a 3-second misunderstanding had evolved into a complex diplomatic, operational, and public relations nightmare that was testing the very foundations of royal security. The decision about how to end the lockdown required balancing competing priorities that seemed to grow more complicated with each passing hour. Her Majesty the Queen, drawing upon decades of experience managing constitutional and personal crises, made the decisive intervention that would ultimately resolve the situation. At 8:30 in the evening, she requested a private meeting with Chief Security Officer David Richardson, Detective Chief Inspector Patricia Collins, and Sir Anthony Davies. The meeting took place in the Queen's private study, away from the crisis management teams and communication networks that had been driving the response throughout the day. The Queen's approach to the crisis reflected her fundamental understanding that the monarchy's strength came not from elaborate security measures, but from public trust and institutional credibility. The lockdown, while potentially justified by security concerns, was undermining both public confidence and the palace's ability to function as a working royal residence. Her intervention came not as a criticism of security decisions, but as a reminder of the broader context within which those decisions operated. The meeting lasted 45 minutes, during which the Queen received a comprehensive briefing on the day's events, the ongoing investigations, and the various factors that had led to the extended lockdown. Her questions were precise and focused, drawing upon her extensive experience with security matters while maintaining the constitutional separation between royal prerogatives and operational decisions. The resolution that emerged from the meeting balanced security requirements with practical necessity. The lockdown would be ended in phases, beginning with the release of non-essential personnel and visitors, followed by the resumption of limited operations, and, finally, the full reopening of palace grounds. Each phase would be accompanied by enhanced security measures that addressed the vulnerabilities revealed by the day's events. The first phase of the resolution began at 9:45 when the palace gates were partially reopened to allow the departure of staff members who lived outside the complex. The process was carefully managed, with each departure requiring individual clearance from the Security Command Center and documentation of personnel movements. The Swedish ambassador was among the first to leave, accompanied by a diplomatic security detail that ensured his safe departure while maintaining the confidentiality of his extended visit. Elizabeth Hayes coordinated the phased reopening from the Security Command Center, managing the complex logistics of releasing nearly 200 people who had been confined for most of the day. Each departure required verification of identity, security clearance, and coordination with external agencies to ensure that released personnel could safely reach their destinations. The process revealed how dependent the palace had become on normal transportation and communication systems that had been disrupted by the lockdown. The media management challenge intensified as people began leaving the palace. Helen Walsh had prepared carefully crafted statements that acknowledged the security review without revealing specific details about the tossing incident or the intelligence concerns that had prompted the lockdown. The challenge was providing enough information to satisfy public curiosity while protecting the ongoing investigations and security procedures. Marcus Wellington was among the last to leave the palace, his departure marking the end of his temporary assignment to royal protection duty. The Metropolitan Police had decided to reassign him to other duties while the incident was fully investigated, though initial assessments suggested that his actions had been within policy guidelines given the information available to him at the time. His experience highlighted the challenges of integrating temporary personnel into specialized security environments. James Morrison remained on duty, though in a modified capacity that reflected both his medical clearance and his central role in the day's events. The incident had been traumatic for him personally, but his intimate knowledge of palace security procedures made him valuable for the ongoing review of protocols and training. His experience would ultimately contribute to significant changes in how palace security personnel interacted with temporary assignments from external agencies. The investigation into the original tossing incident concluded with findings that attributed the event to a combination of communication failures, procedural gaps, and training incompatibilities rather than individual fault. The report recommended comprehensive reviews of integration procedures for temporary personnel, improved communication protocols for security checkpoints, and enhanced coordination between palace security and external agencies. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's medical facility had treated 17 people for stress and anxiety-related symptoms during the lockdown, highlighting the psychological impact of the crisis on palace staff. Her recommendations for improved crisis support services would become part of the broader security review, recognizing that effective security required attention to personnel welfare as well as operational procedures. The broader security assessment that had been triggered by the intelligence documents revealed several areas where palace operations could be improved. The recommendations included enhanced training for temporary personnel, improved communication systems, more robust crisis management procedures, and better coordination between the various agencies responsible for royal protection. The cost of the lockdown extended far beyond the immediate operational expenses. Tourism losses for the day were estimated at several £100,000, while the diplomatic complications created by cancelled appointments and delayed meetings would require weeks to fully resolve. The reputational impact was more difficult to quantify, but potentially more significant in the long term. Government response to the crisis involved several ministers and required coordination between multiple departments. The Cabinet Office conducted its own review of the incident, focusing on whether government security protocols needed to be updated to prevent similar incidents at other protected sites. The lessons learned at Buckingham Palace would ultimately influence security procedures throughout the government. The royal family's response to the crisis demonstrated both their personal resilience and their institutional understanding of the monarchy's role during times of uncertainty. The Duke and Duchess rescheduled their charity engagement for the following week, using the incident as an opportunity to highlight the importance of mental health support for security personnel and emergency responders. Public reaction to the incident was mixed, with some critics questioning whether the lockdown had been necessary, while others praised the thorough approach to security concerns. The palace's handling of the communications aspect of the crisis was generally viewed positively, though the lack of detailed information during the lockdown had created anxiety among those affected. The incident sparked broader discussions about the balance between security and accessibility in modern democratic societies. The palace, as both a working government building and a public symbol, faced unique challenges in maintaining security while remaining open to the public activities that were central to its constitutional role. International reaction focused primarily on the diplomatic implications of the incident, particularly the confinement of foreign diplomats during the lockdown. The Swedish government handled the situation with characteristic diplomatic discretion, but other nations began reviewing their own protocols for official visits to protected sites. The technological lessons from the incident led to improvements in communication systems throughout the palace. New equipment was installed to ensure better audio quality in corridor checkpoints, while communication protocols were revised to reduce the likelihood of misunderstandings during security interactions. Training programs for all palace security personnel were comprehensively reviewed and updated based on the day's events. The new training included specific modules on interacting with temporary personnel from external agencies, de-escalation techniques for security checkpoints, and crisis communication procedures. The incident ultimately led to the development of more sophisticated security protocols that balanced the need for thorough security screening with the practical requirements of operating a working royal residence. The new procedures included better integration systems for temporary personnel, improved checkpoint designs, and enhanced communication protocols. 6 months after the incident, Chief Security Officer David Richardson authored a comprehensive report on the crisis that became a model for security reviews at other protected sites. The report's recommendations were implemented not just at Buckingham Palace, but throughout the Royal Protection Network, improving security procedures while maintaining the accessibility that was central to the monarchy's public role. Marcus Wellington eventually returned to regular police duties, his experience at the palace contributing to improved training programs for officers assigned to protective details. His split-second decision to use the taser, while causing a day-long crisis, ultimately led to security improvements that benefited not just the palace but the entire Royal Protection Network. James Morrison continued his service with the Palace Guard, his experience during the crisis earning him recognition as a valuable contributor to the security review process. The incident, while traumatic at the time, ultimately strengthened the palace's security procedures and his own understanding of the complex challenges involved in protecting the royal family. The palace gates reopened fully the following morning, but the institution had been fundamentally changed by the events of that extraordinary day. The crisis had revealed vulnerabilities that had been hidden beneath the surface of routine operations, and the response had demonstrated both the resilience and the limitations of existing security systems. The lockdown of Buckingham Palace became a case study in crisis management, security coordination, and institutional resilience that influenced security procedures far beyond the Royal Protection Network. The day that began with a simple misunderstanding between two security officers had ultimately strengthened the very systems it had challenged, proving that even the most carefully planned security measures required constant evaluation and improvement. The incident served as a reminder that in an interconnected world where security, diplomacy, and public relations intersected in complex ways, even the most routine procedures required careful attention to human factors, communication systems, and institutional coordination. The palace had learned valuable lessons about itself, and those lessons would influence how it protected both the royal family and its own institutional integrity for years to come.